A man cleaned the garage while his wife was about to take the kids to Costco. His wife, Emily, walked inside twice to check on him. Their son Mason helped for maybe 5 minutes. Their daughter Lily stood near the driveway, covering her nose and complaining about the smell. All of them breathed the same air. Only one of them ended up with a machine breathing for him. 10 days after sweeping mouse droppings without a mask, David Harper collapsed in the parking lot of a Home Depot outside Denver. His lungs stopped pulling oxygen, and by the time doctors figured out what was happening, his chest was already filling with fluid. This is Hidden Pathogens? David Harper believed hard work solved most problems. That was probably the first thing people noticed about him. If something broke, David fixed it. If something leaked, David repaired it. If something looked expensive, David found a cheaper way to do it himself. Emily used to joke that her husband had a physical allergy to hiring contractors. Why pay somebody else? That was David. 39 years old, broad shoulders, former baseball player. Still healthy enough to race his son across parking lots, just to prove he still could. He lived outside Denver with his wife Emily and their 2 children. Mason was 11, Lily was 7. And from the outside, their life looked painfully normal. School lunches, soccer games, movie nights, homework at the kitchen table. The kind of life where medical horror stories only happen to strangers on the internet. Not fathers, not husbands, not people like David. Then spring arrived and David opened the garage. The garage door groaned upward slowly. Immediately, the smell hit him. Not overpowering, not dramatic, just wrong. Dust, rotting cardboard. Something sour underneath everything else. David stepped inside carefully. The concrete floor was covered in tiny black pellets. Mouse droppings, hundreds of them, maybe thousands. Along shelves, under storage bins, behind paint cans. Then he noticed the insulation, shredded pieces piled in the corner beside an old camping cooler. Nests, more than one. The garage had been completely overrun during winter. Jesus! Emily appeared behind him, carrying reusable grocery bags. The second she smelled the air, she backed away. Oh my God! Mason walked in behind her. What is that smell? Mice, David answered casually, like he was talking about weeds in the yard, not danger. Emily immediately pointed toward the droppings. You're wearing a mask, David laughed. It's fine. That sentence would replay in Emily's mind for years. Because later, after the ICU, after the ventilator, after the doctors, she would remember that exact moment and think, I should have forced him. Emily left the garage after less than a minute. Lily never fully entered at all. She stood near the driveway, holding her nose dramatically. Dad, it smells disgusting. Mason helped move 2 cardboard boxes. Then he got bored and ran back inside to play Xbox. Only David stayed. Remember that, because it matters. Same garage, same infestation. Only one person stayed inside long enough. David grabbed a push broom from the corner. The first scrape against the concrete launched dust everywhere. Huge clouds exploded upward instantly. Sunlight through the garage window made every particle visible. Mouse droppings, dried urine, dust, insulation fibers. David coughed immediately, hard. He pulled his shirt over his nose for maybe 30 seconds, then dropped it again. Too hot, too uncomfortable, and honestly, he wasn't worried. Why would he be? Most Americans see mice as annoying, not deadly. David swept harder. Dust rolled through the garage in thick clouds. Every breath pulled microscopic particles deeper into his lungs, particles carrying hantavirus. But David didn't know that, and that's the terrifying part. Most victims never do. Here is what happened inside David's body that afternoon, and here is why it matters. The deer mice living in the garage had been infected for months. Their urine and droppings carried viral particles invisible to the human eye. When David swept the floor, he aerosolized them. The virus entered through his breathing passages silently. No pain, no warning, no immediate symptoms. Tiny particles traveled deep into the alveoli inside his lungs, the smallest air sacs in the chest. From there, the virus crossed into his bloodstream. David could not feel any of this happening. That's what makes hantavirus horrifying. The infection begins quietly. You continue living normally while your body becomes a battlefield. That evening, David showered, ordered pizza with the family, helped Lily color pictures at the kitchen table, watched basketball with Mason on the couch. Emily later said that memory destroyed her emotionally, because while David sat there laughing with the kids, the virus was already spreading through his body. 3 days passed. Nothing happened. David felt normal. Completely normal. He went to work, stopped for coffee every morning, made jokes with co-workers, texted Emily stupid memes during lunch. No cough, no fever, nothing. That's another reason hantavirus is so dangerous. The delay the virus hides. People think, if I was infected, I'd know. But that's not how it works. Victims often feel perfectly healthy for days. Meanwhile, the virus multiplies silently. David even went back into the garage once. Emily caught him organizing tools. "You're still in there," David laughed. "It's cleaner now." Emily shook her head. "Still smells weird." David shrugged. "Probably dead mice in the walls." That sentence terrified Emily later, because she realized how casually close they had all been to danger. Day 6. David woke up exhausted. Not normal tired, the kind that sits inside your bones. Emily noticed immediately at breakfast. David just stared at his coffee silently. "You okay? Think I'm getting sick." By afternoon, his back hurt badly. Deep muscle pain across his shoulders and legs. That night, he developed chills, then fever. Emily touched his forehead. "You're burning up." David shrugged weakly. "Probably the flu, and honestly, it looked exactly like flu. That's why hantavirus slips past doctors early. The symptoms are ordinary: fever, body aches, fatigue. Nothing unusual, nothing dramatic, nothing that screams, your lungs are about to fail." The next morning, Emily forced David to visit urgent care. The waiting room was packed, coughing patients, sneezing children, people scrolling phones miserably. David looked exactly like everyone else. That's what makes stories terrifying. The deadly patient blends in completely. The doctor entered after 20 minutes. Young, healthy male. Fever, muscle aches. Routine, very routine. The doctor listened to David's lungs. Mostly clear, checked throat, heart rate, temperature. They clipped the oxygen monitor onto his finger. The doctor paused. Very slightly low oxygen. Not dangerous, just strange. Number 1. A detail that didn't fit, but not enough to trigger alarm. The doctor moved on quickly. Probably viral. "Rest, hydrate, ibuprofen," Emily asked. "Could it be pneumonia?" The doctor shook his head. "His lungs sound okay." David left urgent care believing he had the flu. But that night, his lungs began filling with fluid, and nobody knew it yet. At 2:11 a.m., Emily woke suddenly. The bed was shaking. David's entire body trembled violently beside her. Sweat soaked through the sheets. His breathing sounded strange, fast, shallow. Emily sat upright immediately. "David?" He opened his eyes slowly. "I'm freezing," but his skin burned under her hand. Emily grabbed Tylenol and water. David sat on the edge of the bed, breathing heavily. Then he coughed, a deep, wet cough, the first one. And for some reason, that cough scared Emily more than the fever, because it sounded wrong. Not throat sick, chest sick, like something heavy was trapped deep inside him. David wiped sweat from his forehead. "I'll be okay tomorrow." He wouldn't. Morning came. David looked worse, paler, weaker. Even walking downstairs exhausted him. Mason stared at him carefully during breakfast. "You look really bad." David forced a smile. "Thanks, buddy." But even joking sounded tiring now. Emily watched him closely while he coughed into his elbow. Then she looked toward the garage door, and suddenly, for the first time, she felt scared of it. Because somewhere deep in her brain, the timing felt wrong. Garage, then sickness. Garage, then fever. Garage, then coughing. But even then, she still didn't understand the real danger. Because who would? Who looks at mouse droppings and thinks, "This can kill my husband"? Almost nobody. And that's why stories like David Harper's keep happening. David tried going to work again on day 7. That lasted 43 minutes. His co-worker Kevin later said David looked grey, not pale grey, like all the colour had been drained from his skin overnight. David sat through half a morning meeting, rubbing the center of his chest repeatedly. Not dramatic, just subtle pressure, like he couldn't get a satisfying breath. At one point, Kevin stopped talking mid-sentence. "You good?" David nodded immediately, but he answered too slowly. "Yeah. Just tired." That pause scared Kevin, because David was the loud guy in the office, the energetic one, the guy who made dumb jokes during meetings and volunteered to help everyone. Now he looked like he was concentrating just to stay upright. Then David coughed, deep, wet. Everyone turned toward him. Kevin leaned closer. "Dude, seriously, go home!" David finally nodded, and while walking back toward the parking lot, he had to stop halfway across the building lobby because he suddenly couldn't catch his breath. That was the first time fear entered his mind. Not panic, not terror, just a quick thought. Something's wrong. The drive home terrified him, not because of pain, because of breathing. David realized halfway through traffic that he was consciously thinking about every breath. In, out, like his body had stopped doing it automatically. At a red light, he rolled the window down even though cold air flooded the truck. Still not enough, his chest felt tight, heavy. He coughed again, wet this time. He looked down at his hand, afterward expecting blood. Nothing. But the cough sounded deeper now, like liquid moving somewhere inside him. David gripped the steering wheel harder. Then his phone buzzed. "Emily, how are you feeling?" David stared at the screen for a second before responding. "Coming home." Not, "I'm okay." Not, "Just tired. Just coming home." And Emily immediately knew something was wrong. Emily heard the front door open around noon. David walked inside slowly. Too slowly. She immediately stood up from the kitchen table. "Jesus, David." His breathing sounded audible now. Not severe, but noticeable. Like he had just finished running. "You need the hospital. I'm okay." Then David climbed the stairs. Halfway up, he stopped. Completely stopped. One hand gripping the railing, trying to breathe. Emily stared upward from below. Fear spread through her chest instantly. Because healthy 39-year-old men do not stop halfway upstairs gasping for air. David stayed frozen there for almost 15 seconds. Then continued upward, pretending nothing happened. Glitch number 2. Something obviously wrong, but still not enough for anyone to understand what. That night, searched symptoms online. Flu, COVID, pneumonia, bronchitis. Every result looked possible, but none felt right. David's fever was high. His body aches were severe. And now the breathing, that breathing scared her most. David sat beside her on the couch, wrapped in blankets, sweating heavily. Lily walked over, holding a drawing she made. "Daddy, look." David smiled weakly, but halfway through responding, he stopped to breathe again. Emily noticed. So did Lily. Children notice everything, even when adults think they don't. Lily tilted her head. "Why are you breathing weird?" David forced another smile. "Because Daddy's sick." Then he coughed so hard he had to lean forward, holding his ribs. Emily grabbed her phone again immediately. This time she typed, "Flu with trouble breathing," and buried deep among search results. She saw something she almost ignored. Rodent exposure respiratory illness. Emily clicked it, then froze, because the article mentioned mouse droppings, dust garage's lung failure. Her stomach dropped instantly. The garage. Emily drove David to the emergency room around midnight. The nurse clipped an oxygen monitor onto his finger, then immediately frowned. "Has he always had low oxygen?" Emily answered first. "No." Number 3. Young, healthy adults are not supposed to struggle for oxygen sitting still. David was moved back surprisingly fast. Inside the ER room, doctors immediately suspected pneumonia. That made sense. Fever, cough, low oxygen. Classic pneumonia. Chest x-rays were ordered. Blood drawn. IV fluids started. David looked exhausted now. Every breath seemed intentional. Like breathing required effort. The ear doctor entered holding scans. His expression changed slightly when he saw David. "You said this started like flu symptoms." David nodded weakly. The doctor pulled up the x-ray. Cloudy white patches spread across both lungs. Fluid. More than expected. The doctor frowned slightly. Could be aggressive pneumonia. Could be. Not certainty. Something still didn't fully fit. At 1:43 a.m., the oxygen alarms started. David's levels suddenly dropped lower. Nurses increased oxygen support immediately, but his breathing kept worsening. Emily watched his chest move rapidly beneath the hospital blanket. In, out, too fast, way too fast. The ear doctor returned, looking more serious now. How long ago did symptoms begin? About 4 days. The doctor looked confused, because lungs usually do not deteriorate this rapidly in healthy adults without another explanation. David suddenly coughed violently into the oxygen masks, wet, heavy, like drowning. Emily saw panic enter his eyes for the first time. "What's happening to me?" The doctor didn't answer immediately, because honestly, he didn't know yet, and that's the terrifying thing about cases. The patient is collapsing faster than the diagnosis. A second doctor entered around 2:17 a.m. Older, quieter. He reviewed David's chart silently for almost a full minute. Then he asked a question nobody else had asked. "Any exposure to rodents recently?" Everything stopped. Emily felt her stomach drop instantly. The garage, the droppings, the nests, the dust clouds. David looked confused. "What?" the doctor repeated calmly. "Mice, rats, rodent droppings," Emily answered before David could. "He cleaned our garage." The doctor looked up immediately. "What kind of cleaning?" Emily's voice shook now. There were mouse droppings everywhere. He swept it all without a mask. Silence, and suddenly, the atmosphere inside the room changed completely. The doctor slowly nodded once, then looked directly at David. "I think you may have hantavirus." Neither David nor Emily had ever heard that word before, but the way the doctor said it terrified them immediately. The infectious disease specialist arrived less than an hour later. That alone scared Emily. Specialists arriving in the middle of the night never means good news. The doctor asked detailed questions. How long was the garage closed? Were there nests? Did dust become airborne? Did he vacuum or sweep? Every answer seemed to confirm something terrible. Then the doctor explained. Rodent droppings dry out over time. When disturbed, viral particles can become airborne. People inhale them without realizing it. Symptoms begin like flu. Then suddenly the lungs start filling with fluid. Emily stared silently because the explanation sounded unreal. How could dust do this? How could cleaning a garage put someone in ICU? Then the doctor said something worse. "There's no direct cure." Emily blinked. "What do you mean?" "We support the body while the immune system fights the infection." Support the body. That phrase terrified her because it sounded temporary, fragile, uncertain. Here's what was happening inside David's lungs that night. And here's why hantavirus terrifies infectious disease doctors. The virus itself was not physically clogging his lungs. His immune system was. Once hantavirus infects lung tissue, the body launches an aggressive inflammatory response. Blood vessels begin leaking fluid directly into the lungs. Oxygen cannot cross properly anymore. Victims essentially drown internally. And the terrifying part? This phase can happen incredibly fast. Healthy adults can go from walking and talking to life support within hours. David Harper was entering that phase now, and nobody knew whether he would survive it. Meanwhile, Emily's sisters drove over to stay with the children. Mason wasn't asleep when she arrived. He stood halfway down the stairs listening. Kids always know when adults are scared. He heard whispers. Hospital, breathing, ICU. Then he heard one sentence clearly. "They think it came from the garage." Mason froze instantly, because suddenly he remembered helping David move boxes, remembered the dust clouds, remembered coughing. Fear hit him immediately. "Can I get it too?" Emily's sister knelt beside him carefully. "We don't know." That answer terrified him more than yes would have, because uncertainty is its own kind of horror. And that night, while David fought for oxygen in a hospital bed, his 11-year-old son lay awake wondering if the same thing was growing inside his own lungs. At 3:11 a.m., the alarms exploded. 1 second, David was breathing hard through the oxygen mask. The next, every machine in the room started screaming. Emily jerked upright from the chair beside the bed. Nurses rushed in immediately. David's oxygen levels were crashing. Fast, too fast. The monitor numbers kept falling despite maximum oxygen support. Emily watched panic spread across the nurses' faces. That terrified her more than the alarms, because medical workers learn how to stay calm. And now, they didn't look calm anymore. David grabbed the sides of the hospital bed, struggling to breathe. His chest moved violently. In, out, nothing worked. It looked like a drowning person trying to breathe underwater. The ER doctor entered quickly, then immediately shouted, "Call ICU!" David looked directly at Emily, and for the first time since this started, he looked terrified, not uncomfortable, not sick, terrified. His eyes moved rapidly between the nurses and monitors. He understood something terrible was happening. Emily grabbed his hand immediately. "You're okay." But even while saying it, she knew it wasn't true. David squeezed her hand weakly. Then he whispered something through the oxygen mask. "I can't." Breath. That's what he meant. He couldn't breathe. And suddenly, Emily understood something horrifying. This wasn't getting worse slowly anymore. This was collapse. Everything after that happened violently fast. More staff arrived, portable monitors, medication, IV lines. David was transferred onto a rolling ICU bed while nurses shouted oxygen numbers across the room. Emily followed beside them through fluorescent hallways, barely able to process what was happening. At one point, a nurse stopped her outside the ICU doors. "You need to wait here." Emily stared through the small glass window while doctors surrounded David inside the room. She couldn't hear anything through the doors, only alarms, constant alarms. And suddenly, the hospital became psychologically different. The ER felt temporary. ICU felt dangerous. ICU felt like death was possible here. Emily sat alone in the hallway, shaking uncontrollably. Then her phone buzzed. "Mason. Is Dad okay?" Emily stared at the message for nearly 30 seconds before answering. Doctors are helping him breathe. She couldn't type the truth. The truth was, doctors were losing. A critical care doctor eventually sat beside Emily around 4 a.m. He looked exhausted already. That scared her too. He pulled up David's newest chest scans on a tablet. Emily immediately froze. The lungs were almost completely white. Flew everywhere. The doctor pointed carefully. Healthy lungs usually look dark on imaging because they contain air. David's barely did anymore. His lungs were filling rapidly. The doctor explained the virus was causing blood vessels to leak internally. Fluid was flooding the alveoli, the tiny air sacs responsible for oxygen exchange. Emily listened silently, then asked the question she was afraid to ask. "Can he die from this?" The doctor paused. Tiny pause, but enough. Yes, that single word changed everything permanently. Before we continue, if stories like this are exactly why you watch this channel, real medical stories that most people have never heard of, take a second to subscribe. And if you're choosing not to subscribe, that's completely your choice. But I want you to do something unusual. Go down to the comments and tell me why. Seriously, tell me what this channel is missing. Tell me what would make you subscribe. I read those comments more than you think. At 4:42 a.m., doctors increased David's oxygen again. Still not enough. His body physically could not absorb adequate oxygen anymore. The ICU doctor approached Emily carefully. "We may need mechanical ventilation." Emily blinked slowly. "What does that mean?" "It means a machine breathes for him." Something about hearing it phrased that way broke her emotionally. Because machines breathe for dying people, not husbands, not fathers, not healthy 39-year-old men who cleaned garages last weekend. Emily looked through the ICU glass again. David's chest moved frantically beneath the blankets, like his body was trying to outrun suffocation. The doctor spoke softly. "If we wait too long, cardiac arrest becomes a risk." Emily felt her stomach twist violently. Then she signed the consent form with shaking hands. Later, she would barely remember writing her own name. The room filled with people, respiratory therapists, ICU nurses, critical care doctors. David looked confused when they explained what was happening, then afraid, really afraid. One nurse adjusted his oxygen mask gently. "We're going to help your breathing." David looked toward Emily standing against the wall, and suddenly he started crying, not heavily. Just silent tears rolling sideways across his face. Because he understood. He understood. This was serious enough that he might not wake up again. Emily immediately started crying too. Then sedation medication entered the IV. David's body slowly relaxed. Doctors inserted the breathing tube carefully. The ventilator turned on. And suddenly, the room became quiet. Too quiet. No frantic breathing anymore. Just the mechanical rhythm of the machine. Shah! Click! Shah! Click, Emily later said that sound haunted her for months. Because it no longer sounded like her husband breathing. It sounded artificial, like the machine had replaced him. At 5:17 a.m., Emily searched Hantavirus survival rate on her phone. Worst mistake. Fatality rate, roughly 35 to 40%. Healthy adults dying within days. ICU photos, ventilators. Stories about sudden lung failure. Then she found real cases. A man cleaning a cabin, a woman sweeping a barn, tourists exposed in rodent-infested housing. Every story sounded terrifyingly ordinary. Normal chores, normal cleaning, normal people. Then sudden respiratory collapse. Emily scrolled for nearly an hour, and with every article, her guilt got worse. Because all she could think about was the garage, the mask she told him to wear, the dust floating through sunlight. Then another thought hit her. The kids! What if Mason inhaled enough? What if Lily did? Emily suddenly stopped breathing normally herself. Panic spread through her chest, because now the danger felt invisible. Every cough, every breath, every memory of the garage suddenly felt contaminated. Back at home, Mason was awake, laptop open, searching. Can hantavirus spread in houses? Can kids get hantavirus? What does hantavirus feel like? Every symptom terrified him. Fever, body aches, breathing problems. Mason suddenly became hyper-aware of his own breathing. Then he coughed once. Immediately, panic hit him. He ran to the bathroom mirror, breathing hard. Am I sick? That's the psychological horror of invisible disease. Once people know exposure happened, every sensation becomes terrifying. Every headache, every cough, every chest feeling. Mason sat awake until sunrise, terrified he was dying too. And downstairs, Lily slept hugging one of David's sweatshirts because it still smelled like him. Around noon the next day, David's oxygen stabilized slightly. Not good, but less catastrophic. The ICU nurse cautiously described it as encouraging. Emily immediately grabbed onto that word emotionally. Encouraging. Finally, something hopeful. She called David's parents, then her sister, then Mason. He's stable right now. But here's the horrifying thing about severe hantavirus. Patients can appear stable right before crashing again. And by evening, David's blood pressure suddenly collapsed. Alarms exploded again. Nurses flooded the room. Medication doses increased rapidly. One doctor muttered, "His lungs are getting worse." Emily heard it. And the brief hope she felt earlier vanished instantly. That emotional whiplash is one reason ICU trauma stays with families forever. You keep thinking, maybe they're improving, then the machine starts screaming again. Late that night, doctors discussed ECMO. Emily had never heard the term before. Extracorporeal membrane oxygenation. A machine that oxygenates blood outside the body when lungs stop functioning. Essentially, a machine replacing the lungs completely. The doctor explained they were approaching the limits of what a ventilator alone could do. Emily stared at him blankly, because the conversation no longer felt real. This started with cleaning a garage, and now doctors were discussing bypassing her husband's lungs with an external machine to keep him alive. The doctor spoke carefully. If his oxygen continues dropping, we may not have another option. Emily looked through the ICU glass again. David lay motionless beneath wires and tubes while the ventilator breathed for him. And for the first time, she genuinely believed her children might grow up without their father. Hospital time does not move normally. Emily learned that by the second night, minutes stretched strangely. Every sound became significant. Footsteps in hallways, monitor alarms, phones vibrating, the sudden opening of ICU doors. Each noise felt like it might carry life-changing information. Emily stopped thinking in days. She started thinking in updates. Blood pressure update, oxygen update, ventilator update. The waiting room slowly became its own psychological universe. Cold coffee, chargers plugged into walls, families sleeping in chairs pretending not to panic. One man cried quietly into a vending machine phone call at 3 a.m. Another woman prayed silently while staring at the floor. Everyone in the ICU waiting area looked emotionally suspended between hope and disaster. Emily became part of that world now, and every time a doctor walked toward her, her heart stopped. On the third ICU day, nurses briefly lowered David's sedation. Emily stood beside the bed holding his hand. The ventilator hissed rhythmically. Sha, click! Sha, click! David's eyes opened slightly, disoriented, slow. He looked around the room confused. Then his eyes landed on the breathing tube. Panic immediately exploded across his face. His body tried to move instinctively. The nurse reacted instantly. David, don't fight the ventilator. But panic doesn't listen to instructions. He tried to speak. Nothing came out except choking sounds around the tube. Emily grabbed his hand harder. You're okay. You're in the hospital. David's eyes locked onto hers desperately, and Emily realized something horrifying. He understood enough to know he couldn't breathe by himself. Then tears rolled down the side of his face. The nurse increased sedation again slowly. Within minutes, David disappeared back into unconsciousness. But Emily never forgot the fear in his eyes, because that fear looked human in the purest possible way. The fear of suffocation. Here's what doctors were fighting inside David's body, and here's why hantavirus terrifies intensive care physicians. The virus targets endothelial cells, cells lining blood vessels. Instead of directly destroying lung tissue, it causes blood vessels to become dangerously permeable. Fluid leaks outward everywhere. Inside the lungs, that leak becomes catastrophic. The alveoli fill with fluid faster than oxygen can cross into the bloodstream. Patients essentially drown internally while still technically breathing. And the terrifying part? This often happens to young, healthy adults with strong immune systems, because in many cases, the immune response itself contributes to the damage. David's body was attacking the infection aggressively, but in doing so, it was destroying his ability to breathe. That's the nightmare. The thing trying to save you can also kill you. At home, Mason stopped sleeping properly. Every night he searched new hantavirus stories online, then checked his own temperature repeatedly. He became terrified of every physical sensation. One cough, panic. Slight fatigue, panic. Chest tightness after running upstairs, immediate panic. That's what invisible exposure does psychologically. It contaminates memory itself. Now every moment in the garage replayed differently in his mind. The dust, the smell, the coughing. Mason remembered helping move boxes for maybe five minutes. Was that enough? He kept asking adults the same question. How do you know if you're infected? Nobody answered confidently, because nobody really knew. Investigators later found evidence of deer mice nesting behind old insulation in the garage walls. That detail horrified Emily afterward, because deer mice look harmless, tiny, quiet, almost cute. Nothing about them visually suggests deadly respiratory virus. That's another reason hantavirus stories feel psychologically disturbing. The danger doesn't look dangerous. No monstrous animal, no obvious poison, no dramatic contamination. Just ordinary mice living silently inside ordinary houses. And sometimes that's enough. Around midnight on ICU day 4, Emily noticed something terrifying. A nurse walked out of David's room looking shaken. Not emotional, not crying, just tense. The nurse immediately disappeared into another room with a doctor. Emily stood slowly. Her stomach tightened instantly, because families learn hospital body language fast. And that nurse looked worried. 5 minutes later, the ICU physician approached Emily. David's oxygenation was worsening again, despite maximum ventilator support. The doctor explained they were adjusting settings aggressively, trying to maintain adequate oxygen levels. Emily barely understood the words anymore. She only understood tone, and the tone scared her. Then the doctor said something she would remember forever. He's very sick, not he'll recover, not he's improving, just he's very sick. And somehow that honesty terrified her more than false reassurance would have. On day 5, Mason and Lily visited the hospital briefly. Emily wasn't sure if it was a good idea, but the children needed to see him, needed proof he was still alive. The ICU nurse prepared them carefully beforehand. There are going to be tubes and machines. Lily held Emily's hand, tightly entering the room, then froze immediately. David barely looked recognizable. Breathing tube, eye lines and machines everywhere. His chest rose mechanically with the ventilator. Sha! Click! Sha! Click! Lily immediately started crying. Not loudly, just silent, terrified crying. Mason stood completely still, trying hard to look brave. Mason walked slowly toward the bed, then leaned close beside David's ear. "You gotta come home, Dad." Emily broke down, crying instantly, because hearing an 11-year-old boy say that inside an ICU room physically shattered something inside her. By ICU day 6, David finally showed signs of improvement, very small signs. Oxygen requirements decreased slightly. Blood pressure stabilized. Fluid levels improved marginally. Doctors sounded cautiously optimistic for the first time. Cautiously, that word matters. ICU staff never trust improvement too quickly, because critical illness can reverse violently. Still, Emily allowed herself hope again. Tiny hope. She finally showered properly, ate real food, answered texts without shaking. Then at 2:13 a.m. alarms erupted again. David developed a dangerous heart rhythm complication. Nurses rushed inside immediately. Emily stood frozen outside the glass doors again, watching staff move rapidly around the bed. The ventilator alarms screamed, medication carts rolled in, and suddenly, the fragile hope she built all day collapsed instantly. That's the emotional brutality of ICU survival. Families repeatedly rebuild hope, only to watch it shatter again. The infectious disease doctor spoke with Emily the next morning. He explained something important about hantavirus survivors. Many never fully recover psychologically, not because of the virus itself, because of the speed. People go from normal life to ventilators in days. Families develop trauma around ordinary objects afterward. Garages, dust, storage sheds, basements, even cleaning supplies can trigger panic later. Emily understood immediately because she already couldn't look at the garage door without feeling sick. ICU day 7 became the longest night of Emily's life. David's oxygen fluctuated unpredictably for hours. Doctors debated ECMO repeatedly. At one point, Emily overheard a respiratory therapist quietly say, "He's right on the edge." That phrase echoed inside her brain endlessly. Right on the edge. Between what? Life and death? Around 4 a.m. Emily sat alone beside David's bed. The room was dark except for monitor lights. The ventilator breathed rhythmically. Sha-click! Sha-click! David looked peaceful, sedated, almost normal, and that visual contradiction disturbed her deeply, because machines were doing enormous work invisibly. Without them, he would already be dead. Emily reached down and touched his hand carefully. Still warm, still him. Then she whispered something she never thought she would need to say to her husband at 39 years old. "Please don't leave us." On ICU day 8, the oxygen numbers finally stayed stable, not for minutes, for hours. That difference mattered enormously. Doctors stopped rushing into the room constantly. The ventilator settings were lowered slightly. Blood pressure stabilized without emergency medication. For the first time since admission, the ICU staff sounded cautiously hopeful. One nurse even smiled at Emily, a real smile, tiny, exhausted but real. And Emily nearly cried from relief because she realized she hadn't seen a medical worker smile in days. That's how completely fear had consumed the room. The infectious disease doctor explained that if David continued improving, they might begin reducing sedation slowly over the next 48 hours. Might, still uncertainty, still danger, but for the first time, the possibility of survival felt real. That night, Emily drove home for clothes. The house felt wrong without David in it. Too quiet, too still. She walked through the kitchen slowly. David's coffee mug still sat beside the sink. His jacket hung over a dining chair. Normal objects suddenly felt emotionally radioactive. Then she looked toward the garage door and froze, because she still hadn't gone back inside since the day he got sick, not once. The image replayed immediately in her head. Dust floating through sunlight, David coughing the broom, scraping concrete. It's fine. Emily physically could not bring herself to open the garage door. Instead, she stood staring at it from the hallway, feeling terrified of her own house. That's what trauma does. It turns ordinary places into horror scenes permanently attached to memory. On day 10, doctors reduced David's sedation carefully. Emily stood beside the bed, holding her breath. The ventilator still breathed rhythmically. Hush! Click! Sha! Click! Then David's eyes opened, slowly, disoriented. He looked around the room weakly. The breathing tube still sat inside his throat. Confusion spread across his face immediately. Then panic. The nurse reacted quickly. David, you're okay. Don't pull the tube. David tried speaking instinctively. Nothing came out, only choking sounds around the ventilator tubing. Emily grabbed his hand. You're in ICU. You got very sick. David stared at her silently, then tears formed again immediately, because somewhere beneath the confusion, he understood enough. He remembered struggling to breathe, remembered fear, remembered thinking he might die. The nurse explained they needed to keep the ventilator a little longer. David nodded weakly, and Emily realized something heartbreaking. Her husband suddenly looked fragile, not physically, emotionally, like surviving something terrifying had changed him internally. The breathing tube came out the next afternoon. Doctors called it extubation. Emily called it the moment she finally believed David might survive. The respiratory therapist explained everything carefully beforehand. Then the tube was removed. David coughed violently immediately afterward. Deep, painful coughing. But this time, he was breathing on his own. Weakly, painfully, but independently. Emily started crying instantly. David's voice sounded destroyed afterward. Barely recognizable. The first thing he whispered was, "The kids?" Emily nodded immediately. "They're okay." Then David closed his eyes and cried silently, because fathers think about their children even while surviving respiratory failure. People imagine survival as a finish line. It isn't. Real survival looks ugly. David couldn't walk properly at first. His muscles had deteriorated rapidly during sedation and bed rest. Even sitting upright exhausted him. The first time physical therapists helped him stand, his legs shook violently after only a few seconds. Emily watched in shock. This was the same man who carried furniture upstairs by himself 2 weeks earlier. Now nurses helped him walk 10 feet. That psychological contrast devastated him. Then came the coughing. Relentless coughing. Every breath still felt heavy. Every movement tiring. And worst of all, David remembered almost nothing clearly after the ICU admission. Only fragments. Alarms, masks, fear. The sensation of not getting enough air. That sensation stayed with him most. The memory of suffocation. One night, Mason quietly admitted something to Emily. He felt guilty. Emily immediately looked confused. Why? Mason stared downward. Because I left Dad in the garage alone. That sentence shattered her. Because children process trauma differently. Mason believed maybe things would have changed if he stayed longer. Maybe if he helped more. Maybe if he warned him harder. Maybe if he made Dad stop cleaning. Emily hugged him tightly immediately. This is not your fault. But Mason still replayed that afternoon constantly. The dust, the coughing, the smell, same garage, same air. Only one person got sick. That randomness haunted him. Lily changed too afterward. Before the hospitalization, she loved helping clean. Afterward, the sound of vacuum cleaners scared her. One afternoon, Emily turned one on upstairs. Lily immediately covered her mouth with her shirt. "Mom, stop!" Emily froze instantly, because suddenly she understood. Lily associated airborne dust with her father almost dying. The garage had infected the children psychologically too, not biologically, emotionally. And invisible trauma can spread through families just like disease does. The infectious disease specialist later explained how rare but deadly hantavirus can be in parts of the American West. Most infections begin exactly like David's: cabins, garages, sheds, basements, ordinary cleaning, ordinary exposure, then delayed collapse. The doctor told David something he would never forget. Most patients don't realize they were exposed until it's too late. That sentence stayed with him permanently, because it meant the danger was invisible from the beginning. David finally came home after nearly 3 weeks in the hospital. Neighbors lined the sidewalk quietly watching. Mason hugged him carefully like he might break. Lily refused to let go of his hand. Emily later said bringing him home felt emotionally surreal, because part of her genuinely believed for days that he would never walk through that front door again. But survival changed David. He tired easily now. Stairs exhausted him. And sometimes at night, Emily woke up because David sat upright suddenly, trying to catch his breath. Nightmares. ICU survivors often experience them, especially patients who remember suffocation sensations. David rarely talked about those dreams, but once he admitted something quietly. In the dream, I can't breathe again. Emily never forgot hearing that. Months later, the garage was professionally cleaned by a biohazard crew. David refused to enter while they worked. Even hearing brooms scrape concrete made his chest tighten emotionally. That's the thing about near-death experiences. Your brain permanently links ordinary sounds to terror. After the cleanup finished, David finally stood inside the empty garage again. Sunlight streamed across clean concrete floors. No droppings, no nests, no smell. But he still felt afraid, because once a place becomes associated with suffocation and ICU monitors, it never feels completely normal again. Here is what I need you to understand. David Harper did not do something reckless. He didn't climb Everest, didn't handle chemicals, didn't enter a war zone. He cleaned his garage, that's all. Same house, same garage, same air. Emily walked inside briefly. Lily stayed near the driveway. Mason helped for 5 minutes. David stayed for 3 hours. That was the difference. That was the entire difference. 10 days later, his lungs were drowning. And here's the scariest part. When David swept that floor, he thought absolutely nothing dangerous was happening. That's what makes invisible diseases terrifying. The delay, you clean, you laugh, you eat dinner with your family. You go to sleep, and somewhere inside your body, something catastrophic has already started. If this story kept you here from beginning to end, subscribe before you leave. Not because it helps the algorithm, because there are thousands of medical stories just like David's that most people will never hear about unless channels like this tell them. And if you're still not subscribing after 40 minutes together, then I genuinely want to know why. Go to the comments and tell me. Not maybe later. Not I forgot. Tell me the real reason. What is stopping you from subscribing right now? I'll be reading the comments, and who knows, your answer might shape the next Hidden Pathogens story. Until then, I will see you in the next video. Good night.